Thank you for joining today's Teaching with Technology Brown Bag session, Visualizing Knowledge, the Basics of Developing Infographics. Our presenters today are Ms. Simone Faree, Mr. Brandon Henry, and Mr. Douglas Onofro from the ETI. To start us off for today's session is Ms. Faree.
So why is it so important for healthcare professionals to be able to use infographics? Well, let me tell you a little story. Once upon a time, there was a smart and capable woman, and you probably remember her. Her name was Florence Nightingale. Nurse Nightingale went to the Crimean War. There she saw soldiers who were dying in horrible conditions of easily preventable causes. In fact, 10 times more soldiers were dying of diseases such as typhus, typhoid, cholera, and dysentery than from battle wounds or other causes. But back home in England, there was this attitude that high mortality among the common soldier is just a part of war. Now, some people did try to present the data for better sanitary practices in comprehensive text and documents, but it just didn't have much of an impact. So what did Florence and her team do? They realized that they needed to make this data more visible, engaging, and memorable. So they made an early form of infographics. Now, infographics have evolved a lot since then, so we're not presenting this particular infographic as the best example of how we do it now. For example, we wouldn't make the text so small, we wouldn't put it upside down. But this is Florence Nightingale's best known infographic for a very good reason. It's because it was able to make the case that wounds and other causes of death were not the main culprits of soldier mortality. Rather, it was those preventable diseases that proportionally greatly outnumbered them. And this kind of data storytelling helped her and her team make the argument for what was then called sanitary reforms. So there's actually a long tradition in military medicine of using visual means to explain information and bring about better conditions for soldiers. Now you might say, but I'm not an artist. And honestly, I'm not an artist either. I'm pretty far from a professional artist. In fact, I couldn't even draw something this good. You don't have to be an artist to make more effective infographics. You don't have to settle for something you find online that has a lot of extraneous information on it that distracts from the story you want to tell, or figure out whether you're going to be violating copyright to even use it. There's a lot that can be done with tools in Google Slides or PowerPoint. And in fact, all the examples that you're going to see in the upcoming slides were created with these tools that you already have access to. And later in the presentation, Doug and Brandon will be showing you how you can use them to make some really good as well. So in this presentation, we're also going to give you a definition of infographics. We're going to identify common categories of them, describe some steps for creating them, and show you some case studies of infographic design using PowerPoint or Google Slides. Now, Brandon's going to start us off with that definition.
Thank you, Simone. So the word infographic is basically a shortened version of information graphic. And here's a definition of it. It's a visual presentation of information in the form of a chart, graph, or other image accompanied by minimal text intended to give an easily understood overview of a complex subject. Now, this is not a universal definition, but we like to use this one because it's fairly broad. Broad enough to cover the ideas of data visualization, which is the creation and study of the visual representation of data. But infographics aren't just data. Ideas can also be represented with infographics. Graphic design, which communicates ideas in an engaging and appealing way. But it's not enough for an infographic just to be visually pleasing. The graphic design should not get in the way of the message. And information design, which is about communicating information effectively to facilitate comprehension. So I think you see this infographic, and I think we'll all agree that this is not working because it's way too much on screen. There's way too much text, which is unreadable. There's distracting colors. You can't really tell what's going on with the arrows and all the other extraneous elements. So the reason that example in the previous slide is not an effective infographic can be explained by cognitive load theory. Or cognitive overload is what you were experiencing with that graphic. The American Psychological Association defines cognitive overload as the situation in which the demands placed on a person by mental work or the cognitive load are greater than the person's mental abilities to cope with it. So it's a situation where learners are given too much information or too many tasks simultaneously. And the result of that is the learner is unable to process any information. And this can trigger anxiety and stress, which reduces further their ability to learn. As a novice, your learner doesn't know all that you know yet. So it's important if they reach that state of overload, they're going to do that more quickly than you would. So you have to keep that in mind. So let's go back to our definition. I wanted to highlight a couple things in here, that it has minimal text and provides an easily understood overview. So that would be an effective infographic. To be easily understood, you use the appropriate type of infographic for the information that you want to convey and get rid of all the distracting elements. And there's not really going to be one right way to illustrate an idea with an infographic. There are many ways to communicate more clearly and effectively. And there are ways that can also distract and confuse the learner. So in this next section, we'll talk about the different categories.
When I first proposed doing this brown bag, I thought there'd be definitive agreement about the categories. But it turns out there's many different ways that people categorize infographics. It might be about how they look, or the idea they communicate, or their purpose, or some combination. And another tricky thing about trying to figure out categories is that some infographics can arguably fall under more than one category. But all that being said, I think there's still value in thinking about how to categorize different types of infographics, because then it helps you narrow down what kinds will be most effective for the story that you want to tell. Different kinds of categories of infographics are better for showing different kinds of relationships. I think there's a commercial out there that says it's all about relationships. And effective infographics are all about relationships because they present appropriately and clearly the relationship between the information or the ideas that you're talking about. And the ones that are ineffective distract from the relationship that tells your story or actually portray it incorrectly. So we're going to suggest the following categories to discuss today based on the kinds of graphics that we see you at using most frequently in your presentations. First category I wanted to mention was grids and tables. You could think of grids maybe as a fancier table that can accommodate more things. Or if you just need to present numbers or simple data in an organized way, a well-designed table might be sufficient for you to do the job. But if there's other design elements or information you want to emphasize, then consider one of the grid templates. So here's an example. It's a grid template from Google Slides. In the first column, there's some numbers to show a sequence. In the third and fourth columns, you're using simple symbols, like in this case, just X's and checks that convey some information. And in the last column, you can add some additional text that aligns with your information. All the information is in different shades of one color, and that brings some visual unity and connection to the information. Now, here's part of a grid from Google Slides. And from the graphic design perspective, I think it's pretty pleasing. But what do you think about when you see these triangles that kind of look like arrows in the second column? So please take a moment and type in the chat whether these arrows work and make sense to you, or maybe if they don't bother you. Some people think they're fine. Some people say that they direct attention to the right or imply an if-then relationship. The larger idea is then pointing or leading to the subtopic. Kind of what I would presume. And that might be the case. That might be something you want to emphasize with this information. But if there's not that actual cause and effect relationship, you're going to want to get rid of those arrows because they're that extraneous information and they're going to distract your learner from what you're trying to actually communicate to them. So remember that these templates that we have, they're all customized. Next category is hierarchy. Dictionary definition of hierarchy says that they're a system in which people or things are arranged according to their importance. There are some hierarchy formats that are quite effective at conveying hierarchical relationships visually, but some others can be misused. So I have another quick question for you. What kind of graphic do we commonly see for organizations that explain the hierarchy of leadership for their employees? Yep, we most went to an org chart. I totally agree. An org chart is probably the best example of a hierarchy. We all default to that pretty easily. And we know, right? The person at the top there, even though you can't even read it, is the highest ranking because their relative position in this chart is on the top. I picked the AFRI org chart because it's the simplest one it uses. But let's talk a moment. How does copying and pasting it here work well for the context of a lecture? Do you think this works? And if you don't, what can we do differently than pasting a graphic like this in a slide? Create your own graphic, yeah. What might you put in your own graphic, though? Yeah, too small, make it interactive. Go through each level on a separate slide, bigger font size. Add a picture. Different shapes, it's true. Yeah, the square maybe is taking up a lot of space. It's not needed. Yeah, I love this. You've come up with some ideas I hadn't considered. But I do think we need to step back and say, why are we doing this? What's the story we want to tell? What did the learners need in this lecture? What are the goals of it? Maybe what they really just need to understand is the positions in this organization. So maybe it's a simpler chart without names at all. Or maybe they need to know the people and their responsibilities. Oh, there we go. Consider a link to a site where the org chart lives that would include any future update. Yes, please. Yes, sometimes even if we could get this with bigger fonts and maybe a better shape, it would still just be a lot of information for people to try to process and they wouldn't remember it. So maybe you could put a link like in a lecture in Canvas or maybe a QR code that would go to that website. And then you wouldn't have to keep updating this. Or maybe how about a handout? One form that's used for hierarchies are triangles and pyramids, but they can be a little tricky. So we're going to show you a triangle here. Tell me, what are the ideas behind this triangle that we're trying to communicate? Fire triad, yep. So it sounds like maybe you've seen this before. What are the ideas for the fire triad? Heat is the utmost importance since it's at the top. Okay. Everybody else think that about the fire triad? There are 3 required elements to have fire, or a combination, that the oxygen in the fuel increases the heat. Our pre-existing knowledge about the fire triad will actually impact what we take from this graphic. So maybe if we already understand that heat, oxygen, and fuel are all equal elements of fire, then it's fine to put it this way and it'll be a little refresher. But if we don't already know that, I think we are going to make some assumptions, perhaps that heat is the most important or the dominant element because it's at the top and that oxygen and fuel are at the bottom. Does anybody have any opinions about the colors that are being used for these graphics? For me, the fact that it's red is this color that kind of draws the eye, right? For instance, we did that warning sign in red and it kind of pops out there. Yeah, oh, there we go. Should be 3 colors if one isn't more important, right? And red seems to communicate warning or stop. Exactly. That's exactly what I was getting at. You're making a difference now between heat and oxygen and fuel by using those 2 different color schemes. Maybe there's a different way to portray this information depending on your audience. Another type of category is cause and effect. That's where one thing or more than one thing causes one thing or more than one thing. Remember, you aren't stuck with the format that slides or PowerPoint suggest. You can adapt them. For instance, in Google Slides, these all came as 3 or more, so we just reduced them to 1. In both cases, I like these for cause and effect because they had those arrows we talked about. Easy for you to add arrows. And we also deleted some elements and we increased the size of the font. I find that the font size is often too small to read in some of these default graphics, so be mindful of that. This one actually comes from the hierarchy tab, but I think it could be used for cause and effect since the first thing's not on the top. So maybe something like this is good for showing how a disease spreads from one sick person to another. And this is a case maybe you'd want to add some arrows here to help show the direction of the cause and effect. And another category is called process, where one thing happens after another for a reason. And so there's some dependency involved. You can't do this before that or lay the groundwork of that. And if it's a process, ask yourself, is it an iterative process or one that happens only once? So if it happens only once, you're going to want something like this, where you show that sequence of events, and it's kind of being reinforced both with numbers and with the arrows to emphasize that flow. On the other hand, if it's an iterative process, maybe you want a circle graphic like this, shows that it's not a one and done. The last category I want to talk about was proportional relationships. It's a rather common one. And sometimes a simple, well-designed bar graph is the best way to express proportional relationships, especially when they need to see the numbers precisely. Now, pie chart can also be used, but it may not be the best option. So what do we think about this pie chart here? What does and doesn't work about it? Too many categories, too many similar colors, no percentages, too many variations of blue and gray. The list is kind of far away from the corresponding images there. It should be 3 colors if one isn't more important. And red seems to communicate warning or stuff. Categories not close to their piece. Yes. So if you're going to do this, which we don't recommend, yes, at least put the categories closer by, label the pieces more directly. So this goes back to the cognitive overload that Brandon was talking about, right? This kind of makes your brain hurt to try to do all that matching. and then just guess at the percentages and how it all adds up and what the colors mean, what they map to. I heard the recommendation that for a pie chart, 2 or 3 categories, I would say you could maybe do 4 or 5. But if you have more than that, consider some other sort of graphic chart instead of a pie. Now let's talk about the process of how we actually create an infographic. And there are just like many different ways to look at categories. There's many different ways to look at processes. So we adapted this one from the University of Chicago and a few other sources to be more aligned with how you in healthcare education can use infographics. First thing that you should do is ask yourself, what is your story? You have to decide what's the story that you want to tell, the data or the ideas that you need to convey. What is the message that you need to get across? Is it about a relationship they need to understand? It's the impact of a problem. If your infographic is about numbers, do they need to know the specific numbers? Or is it more important that they understand the impact of the numbers than the precise amount? Well, here's a real life example, and we adapted it from an app that Brandon uses. This is called a bubble graph, and they're available both in slides and PowerPoint. And the app is to understand the story of energy use in a house. The app has different sections. You wouldn't go to this section if you wanted the precise data, but if you wanted to tell the big picture story in a quick scan, this is really effective, I think, because it's showing the comparative energy use of different appliances and utilities at a particular time. So Brandon could look at this and quickly see what's using the most energy and take any action if he needs to. Next, you think about your audience. In particular, what do they already know and what don't they know yet? Because you're the expert, you've mastered many things over the years that they're just starting to learn. This applies to all the training and design. Understand the prerequisite knowledge of the learner and take that into account. Then you gather and verify your information. Now, of course, given your profession, you already understand the requirement for accurate evidence-based data, but it also needs to be up to date and the right information for the story that you want to tell. And is it the kind of data or the ideas that are going to change? And if so, how will you plan to address that? Maybe if you're going to teach that course in a year or two, put it out somewhere so that you can check it and update it. Now it's time to think about those categories we discussed. What kind of graphic would work best given the story you want to tell? Who your audience is and what information you have found? Are you comparing 2 concepts? Are you showing a hierarchy, a process, a relationship, a proportion? And then also think, what's going to work both best visually and what might be best just as text? Because some things you can show and some things you are going to have to tell, either by saying them in your lecture or in a separate document or as text in Canvas. Now, Doug has some special expertise in color that he wants to share, so I'm going to turn the section of creation phase to him.
Thank you very much. So there are a few things to keep in mind when working with color. While it can be attractive and informative, when not used carefully, it may confuse things. For instance, in the West, red is often used to signify an emergency or a warning, as you may have seen here with the warning icon. So use color thoughtfully. Whatever you use, be sure the colors have a good contrast and that any text on it is legible. So, color can be used to show relationships. If we see elements of the same color, we naturally assume there's some connection. So maybe here we want to show that everyone's on the same team, in which case we would just use different shades of the same color. On the other hand, if we wanted to highlight that there's more in common between, say, the first and second level, then we would use a different color on the third to help reinforce that. Now, all that said, just be aware that color should not be the only way to show information, as those with the color vision deficiency might not see it. So for instance, here's another potential issue with that pie chart. Here's how the same chart would look to someone with a red-green deficiency, or blue-yellow deficiency. And worse still, if you end up printing in black and white, then all the color information is completely gone. So while it's great to use color, think about other ways to differentiate information on top of color, like using different shapes, solid or dotted lines, or even just basic labels. And now I'll turn it back to Simone for some other things to keep in mind when making infographics.
You should consider your color and you should consider your context too. Is this going to be part of a recorded lecture that's going to be embedded on a Canvas page? It may end up pretty small then, so take that into consideration when you're designing. And do you have any learners who are going to be looking at what you do on their phone? Because then you're going to have even less space to work with. But if you're going to give something out as a handout, you're going to have some more latitude. Or maybe you're just presenting in person and you've got a giant screen. You're also going to have more latitude. But still, you never want to overlearn with too much in one infographic. Another element in the process of creation that we want to highlight is font selection. Fonts should be readable and not distracting. These two are good examples of readable, non-distracting fonts. They are Franklin Gothic and Calibri, and in fact, they are the USIS prescribed fonts that are in the brand book. And the brand book not only gives guidance on how to use these two readable fonts, but provides guidance on color, logo placement, and other design elements as well. Now, once you've created your infographic, consider how to best evaluate it. Because you're that expert, right? It's already going to make sense to you. You understand the data or those ideas. So it's a good practice to get some fresh eyes on your work. Ideally, someone who's going to be at the level of your learners. But if not, a peer or someone from ETI would be fine. And ask them, what does it communicate to them? What are the key takeaways? And the last part of the process I would encourage was to think of it as an iterative process, especially if it's part of an enduring course. So you're going to maybe tweak something right away based on feedback, or later because the data or the understanding has changed. And so that, in a nutshell, is one process that you can use to design infographics for healthcare education. So now Doug and Brandon are going to give a quick demonstration on how you can use some of the tools provided by slides or PowerPoint to create something effective and well-designed.
So now we'll cover a little bit about infographics in Google Slides. Now we won't get too into the weeds with details on how to do everything, since every infographic really depends on the data you have and the story you want to tell. So I'll go over a few general functionalities and give you some examples, and then create an infographic using the functionalities. Now, Slides is not as robust as PowerPoint when it comes to adding media like stock imagery and icons, but you can still do a lot and create some attractive infographics with the built-in tools. Depending on your data, you could use a diagram to help start you out. And to choose one, go to the Insert menu, then Diagram, and you'll see some options here. In this case, I'm going to select View All so you can see every option. The options include a grid, a hierarchy, a timeline, process, a relationship, or a cycle. And once you make a selection, you can also customize how many levels each diagram has, or the starting color. Once the diagram is in the slide, you can change the text and resize and rearrange however you need. The other good starting point comes with building blocks, which are found under Insert, then Building Blocks. Now, as the name suggests, they're small pieces that can be used to build larger things. Building blocks are usually commonly used bits of content, like agendas, lists, key statistics, quotes, headlines, and a couple others. And while they're not meant to be infographics per se, you can still use them as starting points if they happen to work. You can also use shapes and lines to build everything manually if you choose. Select shapes or lines by going to Insert, then Shape or Line, and choosing the one you need. You can also select the shape icon or the line icon in the menu bar. So let's start an infographic. Now, looking at my data, it's basically a list of percentages, and the story I want to tell is a breakdown of smokers within specific populations. Basically who's smoking and who isn't. It doesn't have a lot of accompanying text, so I probably don't need a grid. And this data also doesn't fit a hierarchy, a timeline, a process, or a cycle either. I could potentially use relationship, for instance this bubble diagram, but as a judgment call it may get busy and difficult to understand because there would be a lot of bubbles. So I'm going to start with my first set of data, which breaks down smoking by age. And since the data is a statistic, I'm going to open up key statistics and see which one looks promising. And there we go. Now, like the diagrams, each building block is fully customizable, but it makes it a lot easier to first ungroup it by right-clicking the block and then selecting Ungroup. After that, you can adjust the text, the size, the colors, and shapes however you like. So I'm going to adjust these colors and create this section of my infographic. Now once this is built, I can copy different parts of it, like the background shape or text, and expand the infographic until all of my data is in there. Now here's the finished infographic. And somewhere along the way, I decided to use a stylized bar chart with cigarettes as the bars. Now Slides doesn't come with those, so I built them using the shape tool and 3 rectangles with rounded corners. So in the end, this may look involved, but if you start with diagrams or building blocks and learn to use the simple shapes and lines in effective ways, you can build some very engaging and attractive infographics with Google Slides' built-in tools.
Let's walk through creating an infographic on caffeine using the built-in tools in PowerPoint. First, let's go to the Icons button. When you click it, a window will pop up with a variety of stock images, including both icons and photos. We're going to search for a centerpiece for our infographic, so let's type in coffee. Once we select an image, we can use the crop tool to adjust it so it doesn't take up the entire screen. Next, we'll insert a text box. We'll paste in our text, then change the color to white so it's easier to see. Now we can resize and position the text to fit our design. To make the title stand out, we'll change the font, make it bigger, and bold it. Now let's continue building our infographic. We'll add another text box. We can then adjust the size of the text to fit our layout. Next, we'll add a new graphic using the same process as before. Once we have the image, we can select Remove Background from the Picture Format menu. PowerPoint will attempt to remove the background, but if it's not perfect, we can use the Mark Area to Keep or the Mark Area to Remove tools to make adjustments. Finally, we'll resize and position the clock graphic to go with the text, and we can even use the Rotate tool to change the orientation of the image. Now let's create a chart. We'll go to the pie chart option and select Donut Chart. I think this is a great way to represent time. When the chart appears, a data spreadsheet will open. We'll get rid of the extra data, and since we want to represent 45 minutes on a clock, we'll enter 75 for the first segment and 25 for the second. This gives us the 3/4 representation we're looking for. We can customize the chart's look by right-clicking on it to change the colors. To match our theme, we'll select a new color, and we'll even add another icon to the middle of the chart. Finally, we'll add a background using the Shape tool. We'll draw a rectangle to contain the text and graphics, fill it with a coffee color, and then select Send to Back so that we can see our graphic and our text on top of it. With a few final changes to our text colors and positions, we've completed our infographic using only the tools within PowerPoint.
Now let's do some case studies. First one, we're going to show a little bit of our thought process, was that I call the vexing Venn. Now, Venn diagrams can be very useful to show connection and interrelationships, but let's talk a little bit about what do you think the idea that this one is trying to present, and how well does it do that, and maybe what could it do better? Effective teaching require all these components, question mark. Yes, one person thought, yes, it does, but one person wasn't sure. Overwhelming for all the crossing over. Yeah. Some of the elements are in learning design, some are teaching. Interesting point. Doesn't seem to need as many overlaps as there's nothing between the middle ones. Yes, the Venn, if you have overlaps, it's implying a relationship there. It makes me think that you're trying to say that there's some special overlap between reflective and supportive students, and another special overlap between focused on learning and intentionally designed, etc., right? And even there's another special overlap between the three of them. But You're not saying what that is. And in fact, the purpose of this graphic was not to communicate any overlap. It was, as one person said, just that these are the four components of effective teaching. So we've got some cognitive overload here, right? Any thoughts about the colors that are being used here? I mean, I would personally say I think these are pretty colors. I think that would be a beautiful bathroom, maybe, but are they helping the communication or hurting it? Yeah. The color could be suggesting of the relationships, right? Because you have these different greens and they're not distinct enough either. That's also an issue, I think. One thing you could do, something like this, is our friend the pie chart, right? We said maybe 3 or 4 elements is fine for a pie chart. So we could put these in a pie chart that we call effective teaching. That would communicate better the story we want to tell. I wanted to try to do something different though. So I found this default possibility from Google Slides. And I like some things about it. I like that it has those 4 components that are equal size and they're separate. And it's got a plus sign to show the relationship there. I like the fact that now we're all in the blue palette, right? Different shades of blue, because that's kind of tying them together. But I just have some concerns about this effective teaching kind of lump that's kind of stuck on one side, because I'm wondering if that doesn't kind of apply a special connection to the focused on learning and supportive students. And then even though at least we're all blue, we've got 2 different shades there. Focused on learning and reflective are one shade, and intentionally designed and supportive students are another shade. So maybe there's a subtle kind of hint that there's a connection there. So there's a few iterations we won't show you, but I ended up here getting rid of that big blue lump, enlarging things and putting effective teaching back in the middle, making every element the same color. And I think this communicates the story that I wanted to tell more clearly, that these 4 things are equal and they're all part of effective teaching. Now, this is not as impressive as what Brandon and Doug showed you. Definitely not. But we can at least make something that communicates better the idea that our students need to learn. We don't have the distracting elements that cause the cognitive overload. That is really the top priority. We have recently created an online course on generative AI, and this is a table for it, and it's comparing artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, and large language models. And you can see in the first row, we have information about the scope of each. In the second row, we have the primary goals. And then we have a little key takeaway on the bottom. So think of this way. All LMSs are Gen AI. All Gen AI is AI, but not all AI is Gen AI. The table might work for delivering information, but let's have a little talk here about what maybe we could do for a graphic. What kind of graphic might we consider? What's the kind of relationship we want to show in this data? And what part of this data may be visual and what part may not be visual, maybe text-based? Circles within circles to indicate subtype. Yeah, it's definitely possible. Yeah, 2 votes for circles within circles. Well, there's actually 3 votes because when we put this into Gemini went with the circle within circle approach as well. So what do we think, though, of Gemini's attempt here? And what we've talked about colors and text and extraneous information. It's a lot. You don't know where to start looking. Yep. A lot of information to communicate in that manner. Yep. Difficult to analyze. Yep. Not really a step up from the table. The light gray is part of what part of the circle or whatever. Yeah, there's definitely issues in the color. But even when AI doesn't give you something that you can use, it can give you ideas to bounce off. For our graphic, we did in fact go with the circle within circle approach. We took this one from Google Slides. We took the primary goal information and we put it on the side. It's okay. We got some feedback about it though, and we felt we needed to iterate based on the feedback because it seems like the primary goal, it's still distracting. It's not visual. And then also the way we did the visual elements with this template, it's kind of jammed together and hard to read still, not as easy to read as we'd like in the graphic. And it came out as red, and it's like, wait a minute, do we want to do red? I communicate more than we want. Now let's look at our final iteration. You'll see that we remove the text about the goals and we put it in Canvas instead. And then we change the color. And then we decide to expand the circle from the template into an oval. That gives everything more space. You have more space for the text and it's more readable. Not only that, but the text is all within the domain. So that kind of reinforces that. And then we're able to lift up those circles so you can see how one is included in the other in the other. What we also wanted to show you, though, was that when you make a graphic, you can use animation, and that can help you even further emphasize the individual elements of it. So now, if we start clicking, we can see that. I just want you to think about artificial intelligence right now. Listen to me tell you a few things about it. And then when I've made that point, then I might click, tell you more about generative AI and how it fits within the domain, artificial intelligence, and then we'll explain that. And a third click will then show you that large language models fit within Gen AI. That helps guide the learner as well. And so we hope these case studies that we've shown you have given you some ideas as you consider your own infographics. I'll pass it back to Brandon to sum it up.
So now that we know what infographics are, that they can be a simple way to show organized information. We can show hierarchies, cause and effect processes, and other relationships, and that they can be as easy to create as a table or a pie chart in Google Slides and PowerPoint. Now, the demonstrations that we did obviously weren't to teach PowerPoint and Google Slides, but just to show you that using the built-in tools with those programs, you can still create something pretty nice with them. So we hope that you'll consider using more of them in your presentations.
Thank you for watching today's Teaching with Technology Brown Bag. You can view all Teaching with Technology Brown Bags on the USU YouTube channel under the full ETI playlist. Have a nice day.